I have been on a run the last week or two about divine providence, and it seems very worthwhile, judging by the comments and emails I've gotten. I think it's really, really important for both going through life and for worshiping God properly, and also for fighting off the attacks of the enemy, of the devil, and the demons that keep whispering in our heads. So that's what today's little module is going to be about. This morning, when I was praying, I was nervous about a couple of things happening. And, I tried to tell myself that, Jesus, I trust in you. Jesus, I surrender. Jesus, you take care of it. That Jesus arranges everything in our lives to be the most perfect thing, especially the things that cause the most suffering, in order to get us to heaven and to get other people to heaven. That's been my shtick for the last 2 hours of these talks. But then I heard this voice in my ear. It sounded a little bit like that voice at the beginning of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, that little kind of androgynous, kind of little sibilant voice saying, "You don't really believe that. It's not, how can all these terrible things that happen really be for your good? How could they really be good? You don't really think that God takes care of all these little details of your life, do you? And of all these little things that happen? Come on, you can't believe that." I hope I didn't do too good an imitation of that. But in any case, and then I realized what was going on. This was Satan's very, very, very first temptation of mankind, right? In the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So let me read that passage. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say you should not eat any of the tree of the garden?" And the woman said, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, lest you die." The serpent said to the woman, "But you won't die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." We all know the rest of the story. By the way, if I have time, I'll tell I'll tell a joke about that scene. But anyway, we know the rest of the story. You see, the Satan's tempting of Adam and Eve was that you shall know good and evil. You shall know of good and evil. When we say, "Oh, no, 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 God couldn't have wanted my car engine to overheat and me to lose my favorite ever car," the first car I ever bought, which was new when I bought it, which happened to me. God couldn't have wanted me to cook that engine, and have to hitchhike home and throw away the car. That couldn't have been for any good, right? We are assuming that we know good and evil. We know what's good for us and we know what's evil for us. We do not know what's good for us and what's evil for us. It is Satan whispering in our ear that we know good versus evil for us in our providence. You see? So it's the very same temptation. We have to let go of the idea that we know when something happens to us, it's good, or we know when something happens to us, it's bad for us. Okay? Especially, we have to let go of thinking we know when something happens that's very unpleasant, that's bad for us. If we come down with cancer, we don't know whether that's good for us or bad for us. I know that's very un-PC, but it's got to be true, or else you don't have divine providence. Now, it might be good for us because we pray furiously and have a miraculous healing. And that miraculous healing does wonders for our faith and converts our Jewish doctor. This has happened. Not to me, but to somebody I know. So we are just not in a position to know good fortune and bad fortune. So that's really what I want to say. And I thought it was really neat this morning when I heard that slithering voice in my ear. and all of a sudden connected it to the original temptation of Satan. See, because all Satan really wants to do is separate us from God, right? If we're separated from God, we're just, we're just hanging in the wind to be plucked by him like ripe fruit. The only defense we have against Satan is our attachment to God. And if Satan can convince us that God is not really taking care of us, then, among other things, first of all, then, we're really detached from God. But then also, then he can start working on all his other little games, right? Like saying, well, you can't trust God to protect you. You need a big bank account. You need a very money-making career, because that's your protection. Because otherwise, what happens if you get sick and lose your job? You'll starve to death or whatever. All of these protections that we need against fate if God isn't there. That they're in Satan's hands, right? I mean, I'm Jewish, right? Or I grew up Jewish. The entire Jewish world, the main reason why, or I shouldn't say that, but one of the reasons why they tend to be materialistic and money oriented is because they have no safety in God. And they have no safety in prayer, or they think they have no safety in prayer, and they think they have no safety in God. So they need, financial resources to protect them from the world. I don't think I'm going to make this the 2-hour version, because I actually have a whole section in Salvation is from the Jews about this, about Jews and the Holocaust and trust in God. So I'm going to put that aside for now. So anyway, that is one place where the knowledge of good and evil, so to speak, us presuming to have the knowledge of good and evil, is a diabolical temptation. There's another place where us presuming to have the knowledge of good and evil is a diabolical temptation, and that is illustrated in the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13. So I'm going to go into that. Tares are a weed that looks like wheat. Another parable Jesus said to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the householder came to him and said, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then has it weeds?' The homeowner said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The servant said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" Okay? So this is a really important parable. Its only connection with the divine providence that I talked about, well, we'll see whether it has more connection than that, because I always discover things as I talk through them with you guys. Okay, so the wheat that's growing up in the field, those are the souls that are destined for heaven. Those are the souls that will end up in heaven. That is the good seed. That is the purpose of God's creation of life, was to have souls with him for all eternity in heaven. That's the harvest. Now the enemy has come and sown weeds in the same field. And that enemy is, of course, Satan. And when the weeds grow up, they will not be fruit for the kingdom of heaven. They will be fit only to be burned. In other words, those are the human souls that will be lost. Now, God's servants, in the parable, the householder servants, they want to get rid of the weeds. But God says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Because if you think you're pulling up weeds, you're going to end up pulling up wheat. Right? That's what he says. What's that mean? That means that we cannot know, as long as anyone is alive, we cannot know whether they are on their way to heaven or on their way to hell. We cannot know that. If we think we know that, first of all, we are falling for the same temptation of Satan, that we know the difference between good and evil. We are dissing divine providence, because God uses divine providence to convert the most evil people at the very last moment. I can tell two stories about that. One is um, the commandant of Auschwitz. Whoops. The commandant of Auschwitz during the Holocaust. His name was Hus. It's not Rudolf Hess. It's not the same person. It's another person with the same German name. Commandant Hus. And he was the commandant of Auschwitz. He did a lot of evil, needless to say, including being responsible for the torture and death of millions of people. He was convicted. He was given a death sentence by the Nuremberg court, after the Allies defeated the Nazis. He was sentenced to be hanged, and he had a conversion in his prison cell just before his execution. And I have a picture. I didn't prepare it for today's show. I have a picture of him on the scaffold about to be hung, being accompanied by the priest in his vestments to the scaffold. And it was a very earnest conversion. It was not a jailhouse conversion. He wrote a beautiful letter to his wife and another one to his children, saying, basically repenting of what he had done, and saying that basically he was glad that he was going to pay for it by being executed. One couldn't write him off, right? By the way, I'm convinced that his conversion came about in part through the prayers of St. Maximilian Kolbe, of course. But anyway, another wonderful of these stories, which I have a recording of, one of the participants in it. His name was Steve Morin. He was executed, Steve Morin. He kidnapped and tortured and raped. He had a van set up for it, The back of the van was soundproofed. And I think it was at least 8 women. He was really evil. And he kidnapped a young mother, planning to do that to her. And she kept talking, and he was driving her around from ATM to ATM, to take out as much money as she could on her ATM card, before he tortured and raped and killed her. I guess that was his MO. And she kept talking to him about Jesus. And he ended up coming to Jesus, let's say, and turning himself in, letting her go, by the way, and turning himself in, and I believe being executed. So you see, it's terribly dangerous for us to think we can discern between the wheat and the weeds. Because if we decide somebody is a weed, we may have weeds in our family, right? Mea culpa, mea culpa. I can think of a relative of mine that I, for years, wrote off. She's going straight to hell. She did terrible things. Terrible things. I shouldn't even tell you how terrible they were. But she was responsible for a few deaths. Anyway, I won't go into details. Intentionally responsible, at least for one of them. In other words, had them killed. And so I kind of wrote her off. And now I realize I can't. I absolutely can't. What if God's plan was for her to have a last-minute conversion? And what if God's plan was for my prayers to be a vehicle for her last-minute conversion? If I write her off as a weed and don't pray for her, guess what? I'm kind of responsible for the loss of her soul. That makes me a very, very, very bad guy. You see, if we put ourselves in the position of judging between the wheat and the weeds, we're actually being very, very, very bad guys or girls, women or whatever. You can choose your own pronouns on this show. Not. Anyway, um, we can't do that. We can judge deeds, right? We can say there's something very wrong with fornication. That's a mortal sin. That, I mean, we can condemn the deed. You know, we can condemn murder. We can condemn all kinds of things that God has told us are terrible sins. But we can't write off the person. We can't write off the person. Because if we do write off the person, if we go through life writing off people, dollars to donuts, by the time we die, we will have thrown a grain of wheat into the fire with the weeds. Right? Now, Katie says something very interesting. We were all weeds once. And that gets us back to divine providence, you see, because yes, we were weeds. No, we weren't weeds. We can't even tell. We weren't weeds because we're on our way to heaven. By definition, we're wheat because we're on our way to heaven. So we're wheat. Katie, you were never a weed. You just looked like a weed and acted like a weed. I was never a weed. I just looked like a weed and acted like a weed. But that's the whole problem. The whole problem is that when we see a weed, or even for that matter, when we see wheat, we can't know which it is because we don't know what providence is going to do. We don't know what God is going to arrange between the current point in time and the point at which the person dies. And we know that divine providence, until God writes somebody off, all of the divine providence is designed to bring them to heaven until and unless God writes them off. And God doesn't write, I mean, the criteria on the basis of which God writes them off, we are clueless about. We have no idea why God, extends as, we have no idea what God's plan is for somebody, and we have no idea whether God's written somebody off or not. So we certainly cannot decide that someone is a weed. And until God writes them off, absolutely everything in their life is designed to bring them to heaven. And if they look like a weed, I think most of us ex-weeds know this experience. The more we look like a weed, the more painful the providence has to be to put us on the right track, right? Like I mentioned before, Larry Kudlow, who had to almost become a homeless crack addict, losing his family and everything before he, woke up. I know a couple, 12-step programs are full of those people with stories like that. And my bottom wasn't as bad as some people's bottom, but hitting bottom seems to be the normal way that people turn around, and people usually hit bottom. Oh, here's this story. I won't mention his name or anything to identify him, but a man who was in his late 70s who had been living in sin, in other words, living in, with somebody who was, they were pretending to be husband and wife, I'll say, even though they weren't married, and they lived together for whatever 20 years. And he was a fallen away Catholic, and he wanted nothing to do with the church. And he made fun of his younger brother, who was a devout Catholic and everything. And he had I think it was a heart attack. He had a bad heart attack that turned him around, and not right away, through the prayers and intercession of his brother that turned him around. We don't know. But anyway, that's the theme of today's show, or today's babble, is remember the original temptation of Satan was eat of the tree of knowledge and you shall know the difference between good and evil. And you know what? It's still what he whispers in our ear to get us to fail God in two different ways. He whispers it in our ear to get us to fail God by not accepting everything as divine providence, because when something very unpleasant happens to us, we think that can't be good, even though it is good. And the other way is when we see somebody who is extremely offensive to God, is extremely morally repulsive, we think they can't be on their way to heaven. They must be evil. And we write them off and we don't pray for them, and we don't help them. We have to love the weeds as much as we love the wheat, maybe even more, because the God doesn't need us to get the wheat, so to speak, on the right path. He needs us to get what looks like the weeds on the right path. Okay, that's it. That's a short version, but I'm excited by it. So with that, I will say goodbye to the to the recorded short spiritual talk audience. Thanks for watching. Keep tuned. And I will turn to the chat stream and see if there's anything to pay attention to in real time.